Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Canon EOS 40D. It's not a new camera by any means, but I got this camera for like 60 euros including the battery grip, and it actually still takes really amazing photographs. So I just would like to share about this camera with you in case anyone is looking to buy an old digital SLRs or just looking for like budget alternatives to actually get started with photography, because I still think that this camera is still a very good camera to actually start photography with if you're really under a budget. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon EOS 40D, this is not a new camera by any means. It's actually been out for like over a decade now. I'm sure a lot of you guys know that, but I think this camera is still a really capable camera and a camera that, you know, still takes really good images. And when I first got it, which was actually not long ago, I was still really surprised by the image quality that it still delivers. So in this video, it's not a review video, but it's just a video that I would like to just give you my thoughts and opinion on this particular camera and why I still recommend it. So I would like to split it into like the ergonomics, operational side, and then into the image quality, and then my conclusion on this camera. So this camera is a crop sensor camera from Canon. So it does actually take both EF and EFS glass. Usually I like to put the ultra wide EFS on here. And it's actually a really cheap zoom lens that you still can get for a really budget price. And I usually don't keep the lens hood on because I just would like to keep the form factor really small. This is still really small and light compared to like my 5D setup. But anyway, the ergonomics of this camera is actually a lot lighter than I thought. When I first saw the review back many years ago when I was trying to get into the Canon ecosystem, because I started my photography with Nikon cameras and then got into Canon. And when I looked into, like before I got the camera, I looked into different cameras, and the 40D looked to be like this really rugged but heavy camera and everything. And you know, after 10 years, when I actually got my hand on this, this is my first time holding a 40D in my hand. Well, my first 40D, so it's like over a decade later. So yeah, it's actually much lighter than I thought. Like the perception of that camera just changed completely, and usually I also just shoot without the battery grip because I just like to keep it compact, because I don't know, there's something about this camera that I find very cute, which is something I don't really say a lot about cameras, but yeah, it's just a really small form factor camera. Oh yeah, when you attach the battery grip, you also have to attach this rubber bit, and it's somewhere in my room right now, because unlike the EOS R, you can actually take out this rubber bit and then put it on the grip itself, but I don't seem to find a place to put the rubber part, so yeah, there's that. Anyway, the ergonomics of this camera is great. It really reminds me of the 5D Mark II. I think the grip is very similar. The door is also very similar. This is more matte. The 5D Mark II is a bit more glossy, the door, but it feels the same in terms of like how it flips and everything. It takes one CF card, and it's actually the first double-digit camera from Canon to have a reinforced weather sealing, because they started putting the rubberized gaskets onto the ports and doors, and they also raised up the hot shoe plastic part here, so when you mount the flash on, it's also completely weather sealed. So yeah. So in terms of build quality, it's really nicely built. It's out of magnesium alloy, but also very light. And after dropping it as well, it still survived. I dropped it actually a couple of times already, even though I have it for only a few weeks. But yeah, it survived. And this camera is already like way over 10 years old anyway, so that's even like a bonus that it still survived this long. And the operational of this camera, it's very easy, and it also has this Canon new menu system, well, new at the time. So rather than having a list of menu, you have like organized tabs, and they're like really nicely organized, and you can just go through all these settings and just like really quickly. And being a camera that didn't have a lot of features compared to modern cameras, It's just very photography orientated. It's even easier and faster to go through the menu, and I think it is still something that should be mentioned, because even though this camera does not take video and it's still very stripped down, but it's actually adding to the advantage as a photographer, especially if you're just shooting travel photography, portraits, landscape, things like that, or even street photography, because this camera is still very fast when it comes to the autofocusing system, and also just the shutter itself. It's fast and, in my opinion, still quiet. And yeah, so anyway, back to my point is, it's really nice to have that simplified and also just strictly photography orientated menu, simply because if you have a lot of features on your camera, you'll most likely be easily distracted with the features and what the camera can do and how to set certain settings that you want and things like that. You'll be spending more time on the technicality of photography rather than the conceptualization part of photography, or just capturing that moment as a whole, which when I was using this camera, it just like what I said in my 1000D video, my opinion about that camera is, like, if you only have the camera that really strictly focuses on your photography, it just really helps you to really capture the moment rather than just spending the time like, oh, it has this feature, oh, I can use that feature to get this kind of image, which can be good, but usually it's more technical wise rather than like conceptual wise, or just trying to capture the moment as a whole. So yeah, and there's a huge difference. So yeah, there's that. Yeah, other than that, there's not much to really say about this camera. I really like the fact that the mode dial is still here. I really miss that, because like I'm using the EOS R, and there you have to press the mode and then twist and everything. Even on the 1D, you still have to press mode and then turn the dial to the right mode, and I just much prefer having the mode dial on here, like my 5D Mark III. At least my 5D Mark III has the lock up here, which is even better in my opinion, because when you're using multiple cameras, you know, like if the camera is swinging on one side, it will just change on its own, and if you're working with it, it's just not good. So if you're buying this camera to work, especially like as a backup camera, like the second or third camera to carry on your side, then just yeah, keep in mind that this mode dial is not lockable, unless if you just take off the mode dial and just stick with one mode, but who does that really? Anyway, yeah, and I think, yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, one thing that really annoys me about the button on this camera is, on all of my other Canon DSLRs that I use, even professionally, the layout up here is a bit different. The light will always be at the back here, so it's just something to really, well, for me to look at, well, to always remember that, okay, if I'm working this camera, like trying not to look at all the buttons and everything, it's a little bit difficult that the light is way up there versus over here on all of my other working professional DSLRs from Canon. But yeah, that's just like a little nitpick. Oh, and this camera also has the flash, which is something that I personally don't miss, but the flash on this camera actually raises up pretty high. So if you're using internal flash to take portraits, having a higher flash away from the lens means that there's a less chance of getting that red eye that you know, sometimes get when you use flash in a low light situation and take portraits. So that's another good thing about the internal flash, well, the built-in flash of this camera, that I don't find a lot of people mentioning. That being said, of course, there are features, or well, features in the editing software that you can just automatically remove red eye, but if you just don't want to do that extra step, then having a really high pop-up flash helps to reduce that. Not completely, but it helps to a certain extent. So yeah, that's that. I'm not going to talk too much about the screen because it's a really standard 3-inch LCD screen. If you're used to something like even some of the entry-level DSLRs screen, you might find that this screen is actually a little bit on the low resolution side, and sometimes it seems like the image is a little bit blurry when it's actually not. So there's that to keep in mind. So let's say if you're working with the 550D, that screen actually has much higher resolution than this camera, even though the price is roughly similar in secondhand, depending on where you live though. Yeah, that screen will still produce much sharper images than this camera, and also will produce much sharper images out of that camera as well. That being said, this camera still produces nice image, which leads into the photography section. So for like 60 euros, you're still getting like, yeah, 10 megapixel is not a lot for modern day standards, and especially for the technology in the sensor back then, that the dynamic range is nowhere near as good as today's standards. But like, for photography, I still think it's fine. You're still getting really nice Canon skin tones, you're still getting really nice Canon color science. You might need to try a little bit harder to edit in post and clean up certain noise, but it's still fine if you're only going to be posting on social media. I find the autofocusing system still works really great in photography, and though I wouldn't trust the AI servo autofocusing system, but the single shot autofocusing system is really fast and accurate in my opinion, and still put a lot of mirrorless cameras to shame, really, because this is like almost instantly focusing from point to point, whereas the mirrorless camera, even my X-T2 and X-T3 doesn't really keep up with this camera when it comes to the single point autofocusing system. Well, the not single point but single shot autofocusing system, sorry. But of course my X-T3 is a bit more accurate when it comes to AI servo and like just tracking moving subjects, because this only has 9 and its autofocusing system is very slow. Not slow, but inaccurate. It gets distracted very easily, whereas more modern cameras, they're programmed better to avoid certain distraction and just focus more on the subject. So that is something to keep in mind if you're looking to get this camera for sports. I'm not saying that you'll miss a lot, but it's just that if you compare it to the modern day semi-professional to professional mirrorless cameras, this camera is really inaccurate. But if you're just shooting like portraits, simple portraits, landscape and everything, the autofocusing system on this camera is still really quick and really accurate. So yeah, and I just moved to operational side for some reason. Anyway, back to the image quality. So as I left off, that you kind of need to work a little bit harder in post to get like the same amount of dynamic range, or reached the same amount of dynamic range as modern day mirrorless cameras or even modern days DSLRs. But for social media, I think it's just okay, because you're not using a lot of pixels, and when you're recovering, let's say, shadows and it shows a lot of noise, for example, if you recover like 100% shadow and then you still boost the exposure by a bit and a lot of noise really appears up, yes, the image is going to be a little bit soft because you're really pushing the quality of the file, but because the resolution on social media is not really high, you can kind of still trade away with the 10 megapixels to denoise that and just have a more usable image to post. Otherwise, if you don't really work in harsh lighting situation, then the images are definitely fine. If you're editing like skin tone, retouching, landscape, things like that, just like the typical Canon color files, the colors are really nice, and the roll-offs into the highlights and shadows are really natural. So that's something that's really good about Canon cameras in general, and this camera definitely has that. So that's good. And oh yeah, back to the operational side a little bit. Yes, it does shoot 6.5 frames per second, but you have to remember that this is an older camera. The buffer is not that good. If you're shooting in JPEG, you can kind of get away with a lot of images, but if you're shooting in RAW, it will only last like a couple of seconds at most, and that's it really in terms of frame rates and autofocusing system. So into the conclusion, I realize that this video is a little bit short, but I really don't have a lot of negative points to say about this camera. All I can say is that the image quality is still really good out of this camera if you're not working in super harsh lighting environment, and if you're working in like harsh landscape lighting environment, at least you still can shoot bracketing and it will give you the quality you need. Well, close enough in certain cases, depending on how high your standards or what kind of images you're really looking after to get. And also for the performance, I feel like this camera still performs. The menu and everything is very responsive. The images are great out of this camera regardless of the picture profile you choose, and the raw files are still really robust for a lot of application of photography nowadays. And the build quality is really there. It is weather sealed, so for like 63 euros that I got it for, a lot of people will, like, I know a lot of people who got it for like under 50 euros. Obviously this really depends on like where you live and everything, because secondhand market does not have like a benchmark price across the world, and some parts of the world where the living standards are higher, or the living costs are higher, and they pay more taxes and everything, the secondhand products will also be more expensive. But that also depends on the product itself and the popularity of that product, I'm aware. So don't take my word, just because I got it for like 60 euros doesn't mean you will get it for 60 euros. It could mean that you can get it a little bit more expensive, but also a little bit cheaper. So in some cases, I actually heard that someone got it for like under 30 euros. So congratulations to those people, I guess. But yeah. My point is, it's still a really, really cheap and affordable camera to get, and it accepts a lot of quality glass and also not so high quality glass from Canon, which are still really, really affordable. So it is still a really tough camera, because even though a long time has passed by, but this camera, the build quality, as I told you that I dropped it like at least twice, it still survived. The build quality is still there. And if you're just really starting out, I think that this camera is also great. It has live view feature, and you can select the exposure simulation mode, so you will know what you're gonna get when you put in each setting into the camera. So that's a nice benefit as well. That being said, if you're using live view, the autofocusing system will not work as, like, it's not the same as using the viewfinder, so it'll be a lot slower as well. So yeah, just keep that in mind. It's like the first generation of Canon live view system. So yeah, there's that. Whew. It's just, there's not much to really say bad things about this camera, but I also have to mention some bad things, otherwise it's just gonna sound like I'm too biased towards this camera. So a lot of problems, like, I've been looking through different forums and everything, so a lot of problems that people experience with this camera are just mainly like, one is the shutter lag. So over time, this camera can experience shutter lag issues, and apparently I've been told that this is very common from 20D all the way to 40D line of cameras. So it's not a lot of people who experience this, but some people do experience this. So what shutter lag is, even though the camera says it confirms that it's in focus, and you press the shutter, like the full shutter button, sometimes you can be waiting between 1.5 seconds to like 2.5 seconds before the shutter actually clicks. So do watch out for those cameras, at least before you buy them. Just, if you get a chance to try it, then try it. Otherwise, you can always ask the seller if there's any problem with the camera. On the other hand, like, what I figured out about this camera after I got it is actually this dial is kind of broken. If you move quickly, it's working, but if you move slowly, as you don't hear any sound, it's like the clutch is kind of gone and it's not really giving any signal to the motherboard that it's operating. So that's the problem I ran into with this camera. And yeah, it's just issues that the seller wasn't really telling me, and it's also the issue that I never experienced with my other Canon cameras, so I didn't really have to ask for it. But apparently that issue, like those issues, do exist from camera 20D all the way to the 40D line. But if you have enough budget, then you can always move over to the 50D, like upgrade it, because it's only like a couple of, like, maybe 10 or 20 euros more to get to the 50D line. Again, this really depends on where you live, because the 50D actually, though, has slightly, ever so slightly lower autofocusing system, but it has 50% higher megapixels, and the low light situation on that camera, or the low light capability of that camera is also nice. Not that the low light like low light performance of this camera is bad. It's actually okay. It's not that good compared to the modern day standards, but it's still not bad. It really isn't bad. If you're using higher ISO than 3200, okay, I would say look somewhere else. Or even like if you're doing professional work, then try not to go above 1250. But if you're just like shooting for Instagram, things like that, I think I wouldn't go higher than 2500 or 3200. 3200 is like if you're not going to be recovering a lot of shadows, otherwise a lot of noise will pop up. But 2500 is kind of like in between. So yeah, but if you're really working for professional work, then as I mentioned, don't go above 1250 ISO. So yeah, I will just leave it here. I think, yeah, if you're looking for like a nice backup camera or a camera to start photography with, or just a secondary camera that is still really like functioning really well and still delivers good quality and you don't need higher than 10 megapixels, then I'd say that this camera is a nice camera. You can't really go wrong. If you drop it or if you lose it or whatever, it's still like under 100 euros for this camera, and it is weather sealed, it is tough, it is still a very fast camera. So yeah, if you need a free photography guidebook, it's linked down in the description below. So as my 2021 photography calendar, they're both absolutely for free digital downloads. And yeah, if you have any questions, please leave them down below. Otherwise, I wish you a great time and have fun shooting. Stay safe and bye for now.